There certainly is verbal communication in other species, and there's evidence that, for example, chimpanzees have nouns. They have names for things, and they can use those names for things, and other chimpanzees will know what they mean. We've ended up with a brain that's basically 5 times bigger than most mammals of our size. Even you go back through the amphibians and the fish, even back to the jawless fish, it still kind of looks like a vertebrate brain. The weird thing is humans really are the only species that we know of that has ever prioritized its brain in this way. So we only have a sample of one. If it is such a good idea to take that path, why are we the only ones who've really done it? Because it's all we can't really do much else. We're pretty defenseless, weak little creatures, and yet we're the ones who've taken over the world.
Do you consider humans to be the most intelligent vertebrates? How are some brains, like those of elephants, bigger than ours, yet we are considered smarter? How are birds with brains the size of peanuts able to solve puzzles faster than some primates? And if evolution's all about the survival of the fittest, then why did the brain, the most energy-hungry organ, ever evolve? Are human brains actually special, or are they just different? Hello, I'm Avnish, and this is The Early Perspective. Each episode, we explore how the brain works and what that means for how we learn, think, and behave. For today's episode, we're zooming out millions of years and talking about one of the strangest stories in science: how vertebrates evolved and how their brains diverged and eventually produced us, the most introspective, anxious, self-aware primate on Earth. We're also going to be talking about how the brain is vastly different, yet shares some similar traits amongst different organisms. Joining me here today is Dr. David Bainbridge, a reproductive biologist and comparative anatomist at the University of Cambridge. Trained originally as a veterinarian, he went on to study zoology with a focus on vertebrate evolution and neuroscience, and he's also worked at both the London Zoo and the University of Oxford. For over 2 decades, he's taught neuroscience, anatomy, and reproductive biology at Cambridge, and having written over 10 popular science books in which explore the brain, genetics, evolution, and more. Dr. Bainbridge, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So before we really get into the heart of this episode, I just want to start with you. Could you tell me a little more about how you got started? And thinking back, if you went back to the first time you looked at a brain or dissected it, what was the thing that surprised you the most?
I ended up in biology indirectly, really. And still really think more like a physical scientist. I was all sort of maths, physics, and chemistry, I guess, when I was at school. I didn't do any biology at school. I was always interested in it, but I never actually did it as a formal subject at school. And then it was really, I suppose it was when I thought being a veterinarian was a good way into lots of interesting careers. And so it was really when I was training as a veterinarian, and obviously as part of that, you have to do um, anatomy of things in general, but the brain in particular. And it was really then that I sort of realized that there was something kind of different about the brain. It will just have been probably just the species we were working with, mainly dogs and sheep in the anatomy lab. And I just realized, I mean, by then we'd looked at almost every other organ in the body. And to be honest, every other organ in the body, with the possible exception of the heart, each bit is pretty much like any other bit. You find a bit of liver, you move sideways a few centimeters, and the bit of liver you're in, it will just be the same. Whereas the brain, you can just see from looking at it that it's varied, it differs. You can see that the anatomy varies. So it's really, I think, that realization that it's got an internal geography in a way that no other organ has. And that's what really sort of fascinated me about it.
Mm-hmm. So was there any, you said that you mentioned dogs and sheep, I believe. So, was there any particular species that instantly hooked you in?
Well, the interesting thing is when you look at the brains of the domestic mammals, which of course is what vets concentrate on first of all. We haven't got on to looking at things like birds yet. They're actually remarkably similar. They're remarkably small when you're used to the size of human brain, and they're remarkably similar. It's all the same parts. You see emphasis of different regions in different animals. There's certainly different mammals. They're all kind of quite similar. So really, I suppose it's the dog and sheep simply because we were dissecting dogs in general. We start off with a whole dog at the beginning of the veterinary course, and by the end of the first 2 years, there's nothing left because you've dissected it all. And also, I just thought maybe they're just easily available. We had preserved sheep's brains as well, with all sorts of bits attached onto them.
Yeah, I think it was quite the same for me. I took anatomy last summer at Berkeley, and there at the lab, they had sheep and I think pig organs where we dissected that. It's because probably because it was readily available. And I agree with the fascination for the brain because if you look at like the liver, as you talked about, there's not that much difference in its different parts, even though it has, four, I believe four parts. And then the brain just is different every single area and it's all specialized. So I agree, the brain is very unique in a way. So I think with that, let's really start beginning to dive into the primary topic of our discussion. That is, how has the brain evolved and is different between organisms? I think a good place to start is by just establishing some basics. When we say the brain in an evolutionary context, what are we even talking about? How would you define the brain? Like, for example, is a shark brain and a human brain just the same thing, or are they just in the same category?
I mean, I think a brain is it's a collection of nerve cells. It is possible to have a nervous system where there isn't much centralization. So you look in something like, I don't know, a millipede or something like that, and they have a sort of ladder-shaped nervous system that pretty much extends along the body. And there's not there it's a bit bigger at the front end than it is, halfway down or at the back, but it's not dramatically bigger. Then there's a point that you get to where you just see a certain region that's just got a lot more nerve cells in it than the rest. And a good example of this would be, say, a fly. And after a while, you just say, well, it's so focused in one particular region, you have to start calling it a brain. And I think in the big scheme of things, across all the animal kingdom, I think that's what it is there's a sort of fairly arbitrary point where you just have to say, yeah, there's enough of the nervous system is focused in this one place that I'm going to call this a brain. It tends to be, I mean, certainly in insects and invertebrates, it's ended up being at the front end. And I think the reason for that is that's where many of the sense organs are, because that's the bit of the animal that meets the environment first. And also that's where the jaws are as well in both insects and vertebrates. Even though insects and vertebrates, but their brains aren't equivalent to each other. You go back hundreds of millions of years, their common ancestor, the thing that gave rise to both insects and vertebrates, will not have had a brain. So we've sort of independently evolved brains. But then again, so things like octopuses and squid and things like that. So it is something that's happened more than once over the course of evolution.
So, since we're anyways establishing some more basics, let's talk about cognition and intelligence. How would you define that specifically?
Yeah, there's certain words that are always quite hard to define. Cognition, intelligence. Another one, which is even worse, is consciousness. I mean, cognition really is just, if ever you hear the word cognition, you think what they're talking about. Probably the best thing to do is it just means thinking. And so it is, I suppose, the architecture we have inside our brain for moving information about, processing information. And you could say, well, how does that differ from intelligence? I would say not too much. I think intelligence perhaps is sort of like is the ability to direct your cognition to do certain things. There's a bit more, I suppose intelligence has a bit more, it's a bit more of a value judgment than cognition. Very, very simple things could be cogniting. They could be thinking in some way. But then there's a sort of threshold that you think that animals have to get beyond when they start being intelligent. Again, where that is, there's no clear sort of signpost in nature that suddenly sticks up and goes, okay, this animal's got to that stage.
Right. So, would you say that any organism with a brain can perform cognition?
I think you could argue it, yes, on a very simple level. I think this is something that people wonder about quite a lot, even to the point of wondering, because we always assume that, say conscious, some people, for a long time, people thought consciousness was something that only humans had. And now people tend to think that more and more animals have it. And there's nothing to say that consciousness could be more widespread than intelligence, because we don't really know what consciousness is at all. It's impossible to measure. No, no, we haven't really defined what it is yet. Um, but I think you can say that animals with smaller and simpler brains than us, and animals that aren't vertebrates, are undergoing some process of cognition. Intelligence, yeah, I guess it depends, sort of how you value things, I suppose.
So, even though you're saying that intelligence is really hard to quantify, do you consider humans to be the most intelligent vertebrates?
I mean, we certainly have the most evidence of using our intelligence to do. There's certainly things that we can do which other animals can't do, and some of those things will be because we're intelligent. I mean, there's certain. I mean, this because the things we often get compared with are things like whales and dolphins, and there are some things that they can't do that we can do, but that's probably just because they're in the sea, to be honest with you. Uh, I mean, the what are the things we can do? We can use tools. Not many animals can use tools. We can also use tools to make other tools. That's very unusual. It's not unique. Um, there's some evidence that some crows can do things like that. That's pretty unusual. Um, we can plan very complex behaviors before we do them, along with others. Again, not many animals can do that. Killer whales can probably do that, probably just as well as we can. I suppose I suppose technology, and then agriculture, um, and then I suppose the big one that everybody goes on about is language. I don't think, I mean, people who work on codes and undeciphered languages from the past, there are various methods you can use to look at a body of information and see if it is a language, even if you can't actually decipher it. And if you apply that to animal communications, they don't seem to have language in the same way that humans do. This ability to use a fairly restricted number of sounds to basically express an infinite variety of things. So I think certainly the evidence of what we're able to do, we're certainly able to do more with our intelligence than any other animal, which does make you wonder if we are more intelligent than any other.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, especially when you're talking about language, isn't that a topic of a lot of debate in the scientific community, especially surrounding, I believe, whales with their ability to communicate with each other?
Yeah, there certainly is verbal communication in other species, and there's evidence that, for example, chimpanzees have nouns. They have names for things, and they can use those names for things, and other chimpanzees will know what they mean. Um, but it seems that to have a language, I mean, I suppose basically, if you need it for a full language, you need nouns and verbs combined at the same time. I mean, this is what early computer pioneers discovered is they said, okay, I need to tell my computer to do something. What do I do? You go back to say the early, Apollo 11 spacecraft. They put in two numbers, and the first number was effectively a verb, and the second number was effectively a noun, which is basically, I don't know, switch on the ventilation or something like that. And that in itself is already a language. And I don't think there's evidence that other animals can do that. It may appear, but I'm not sure it does. But they can still shout individual concepts and nouns at each other. So
Yeah, I feel like with that important point, let's try to make this conversation less abstract. So, diving into the conversation, let's talk about really the elephant in the room. A common misconception about the brain is that larger brains equal to more intelligence. I remember learning about evolution in the seventh grade and how humans have a bigger brain than many organisms, which makes them smarter. But of course, simple research can also contradict that. For example, you have Neanderthals, which are our evolutionary cousins, who are very genetically similar to modern humans, yet they have a slightly bigger brain on average. But modern humans have better skills when it comes to complex planning or abstract thinking, according to research. So many animals have a lot bigger brains, like all elephants and dolphins, but we don't see elephants writing symphonies. What actually matters for intelligence? Size, structure, or is it just an entirely different thing?
In some ways, I think it is actually largely size. However, it's not just simple absolute size. Um, it's to do with how the size of the brain relates to the body. So if you sort of took all the different mammals, well, let's see, I would do it with something else. Let's say do it with, I don't know, frogs. If you measured the weight of all the different species of frog and you measured the mass of their brains, you'd find that there was basically a very clear mathematical relationship between the two. As frogs get bigger, their brains get bigger. They don't get bigger as quickly as the frog does, but they do get bigger. So I don't know. If you've got a frog that's 8 times bigger, its brain might be, I don't know, 3 times bigger. And this relationship, you look within frogs, this relationship is pretty consistent. There's a bit of scatter on your graphs, but surprisingly little. And then if you do the same thing with birds, again, you get the same relationship between brain size and body size. Um, and again, to the extent almost if somebody tells you the mass of the bird, you can work out what the mass of the brain is likely to be. And they all kind of fall on that line in on that graph. Even the ones that you think of as being incredibly clever, like parrots and crows, and the ones that you think of as being incredibly stupid, like turkeys and guinea fowl and things like that. Uh, you look at the mammals, and the same is true. And it's for this reason that the very biggest brains tend to be in the very biggest mammals. So, I mean, just for compare, I mean, the human brain is about 1.5 kilos. The biggest brain in existence is the sperm whale, which is 8 kilos. So, what's that? That's about 5 times bigger than our brain. So they've got the biggest brain, but actually, compared to the size, that they're a lot more than 5 times bigger than us, aren't they? So even though they're bigger, the brain doesn't get bigger as quickly as the animal does. And so you look at the mammals, and they all basically lie along this same scatter line on the graph when you compare their brain size and their body size. Even when you look at something like a chimpanzee, okay, yeah, they're one of the cleverer ones, so they're sort of towards the top end of the noise, but they still kind of fit the story. And so within all the other mammals, or within all the birds, or within all the amphibians, their brains are all roughly the same size in comparison to their body. And yet you have clever ones and you have stupid ones. So to that extent, brain size doesn't seem to be important. Humans are the weird exception because we know that over about the last sort of 8 million years or so, our brain has jumped to being about 3 times bigger, 3 times bigger than, say, the same size chimp. Chimps are actually about the same size as us. And our brains are about 3 times bigger. And you can see this happening in the fossil record. And so we've ended up with a brain that's basically 5 times bigger than most mammals of our size. Chimps are a little bit bigger than the average mammal, they're towards the top end of the normal range, but we're way off the curve. And there are very strange things about that. One is we can think about what makes the human brain different, but I think that probably the main thing that makes the human brain different is just sheer capacity, just sheer size. And that's all very well, but it does raise the question of, well, why has no one else ever done this? We can probably talk about that in a bit, but there is one of these things. It is one of these things where humans do seem to be actually in this situation actually unique. They've become a lot more intelligent by making their brain a lot bigger, and many animals don't seem to need to do that to behave in a more intelligent way.
Right. So is how much does a factor like brain to body size, like the ratio, matter? For example, like if you look at ants, they have I think one of the largest brains compared to their body size, right? How much does that matter for intelligence or cognition in general?
Well, within a group, it doesn't seem to matter very much at all. I said that there's a sort of relationship between the size of the brain and the size of the body. In fact, what you do is if anybody out there's done logarithms yet, you take a logarithm of the brain size, logarithm of the body size, and basically it falls out on a straight line on your graph. So within that, the different, I don't know, fish or whatever it is, will be along that, will be somewhere along the fish line. The social ones and the predatory ones, maybe just towards the top end of the fuzz, or the scatter along the line, but they'll still be on the line. So it's not as if you usually have like the occasional really intelligent fish or the occasional really intelligent bird that stands out because of its brain size. You do get the intelligent ones, but their brains aren't dramatically different in the way that humans are compared to all the other mammals.
What about structural differences within a certain species? Like, for example, there's genuinely a difference in the structure of a certain organism's brain.
I mean, within vertebrates, one of the funny things about vertebrates is the basic plan of the nervous system is the same across the vertebrates. And at first, you might think, "Oh, that's a bit boring because they're all the same." But in a way, that's more interesting because, first of all, it makes the origin of the brain very mysterious because it means we don't really have access to any intermediate stages. Even you go back through the amphibians and the fish, even back to the jawless fish, it still kind of looks like a vertebrate brain. It's a bit distorted and changed in different ways. But the strange thing, all the basic components are there. You have to go to things which are really quite distantly related to us before you see things that look like they might be an intermediate stage. Things like the larvae of sea squirts and things like that. They have something that looks like it might be a kind of proto-brain, but you look within the vertebrates, and there's not actually that much variation in bits and pieces at all. There are differences in emphasis on different regions, certainly. So for example, in birds, the region that deals with vision in the brainstem is particularly large. But we have it, but it's just in birds it's bigger, and in mammals, the bit that processes smell is particularly large. Not in humans, but in most mammals it's particularly large. Whereas in birds it's very small. They do have it, but it's all the same bits, but different emphasis on the different bits. Which I have to say is sort of the case with vertebrate anatomy in general, is they tend to kind of apart from the difference between fins and legs, all the other bits kind of are the same in fish as they are in people. They're just sort of weirdly distorted to help you either live as a fish or a human.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, I think that was a very big question, especially about brain size and structure, because many people don't really understand how that would correlate to intelligence, because intelligence itself is a very abstract idea.
People they've been looking for the thing that makes the human brain different for a long time, and they haven't convincingly. There are some possibilities, but they haven't convincingly found it yet. It may just be because it's big.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the human brains. I mean, if you look at any brain, including the human brain, just very hard to really understand and pinpoint the real differences and changes and why that came about, right? Like you can extrapolate some information, but getting that exact answer is always going to be quite difficult. So let's just pivot to something else. Us humans, of course. Humans are a very unique and an interesting species because we're quite self centered, highly intelligent, but also self aware. And this is very unique in many vertebrates and mammals in general. So if we go back to evolution 101, essentially, if you look at Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, it's talking about the survival of the fittest, where the most well adapted organism will survive and reproduce and pass its adaptations along. So, if you take, for example, a snake with a potent venom, it might allow it to dominate in an ecosystem, which leads to adaptations and evolutionary changes. So, knowing that, why didn't we have any such changes? Why did the human brain get prioritized as its evolutionary advantage? Why don't we have 10-foot height or claws, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said earlier, it's the weird thing is humans really are the only species that we know of that has ever prioritized its brain in this way. So we only have a sample of one. We don't. It's always difficult when you're doing comparative and evolutionary studies. If you only have one example, you're often just speculating on the reasons why. I mean, you can sort of come up with some good reasons why being very intelligent. I mean, so natural selection is all about increasing the your reproductive success. If you have a trait which can be inherited in some way, which increases the success of your offspring, then that trait just arithmetically will become more common, and the gene that causes it will become more common in future generations. Um, and to do that, there has to be an advantage. It has to give your offspring an advantage. And also, even just a little bit of it has to give them a little bit of an advantage because we think evolution doesn't normally occur in big jumps. We think that the brain probably got bigger, although it was over evolutionarily wise quite a short period of time, it will still have been many, many generations. And so there has to be this sort of incremental benefit to changes that we do. And you can think of what those benefits might be. You can see that humans' ability to make tools, to cooperate, um, we know that those two things mean that humans have very high survivability. You look at hunter-gatherer tribes, they often do better than other species when times get hard, like in times of famine. They're very good at focusing on hard to find or hard to acquire, but high value energy sources, food sources, for example, that other animals don't have access to. Um, we also know that the survivability of infant humans is very high compared to most infant primates. Um, obviously, I mean, one of the main differences between hunter-gatherers and humans living in developed countries is that they have relatively high infant mortality, but even then, it's still quite a bit less than it is in most primates. And so we know that so we've sort of developed this information economy where we have all of this cultural and technological information that isn't in our genes, but we pass it on from generation to generation. And that gives our offspring huge advantages, and that is presumably why it was selected for. In a way, the harder question is why did nothing else ever do this? If it's such a brilliant idea, and humans have invested, as you suggested, so much energy into this, our whole life is based around basically supplying our brain and keeping it going. Um, if it is such a good idea to take that path, why are we the only ones who've really done it? Because it's all we can't really do much else. We're pretty defenseless, weak little creatures, and yet we're the ones who've taken over the world, um, which is fine, and it's all to do with the brain. But if it's such a good idea, why didn't anything else do it? And that's the thing I think we don't really fully have the answer for.
Yeah, because is there anything you could even like particularly narrow down like about why the brain is really prioritized despite its energy need, especially because it's incredibly inefficient in a way because it takes the most energy of any organ. I think it takes about 10% of your body's energy, even though it's about only 2% of your body mass. So then why? Why would that be prioritized?
And also, you've got to think about how it uses a lot of energy because of how long it takes to develop. It takes humans about 20 years to develop, and that's largely because of their brain and what their brain had, the way their brain has to change and the way their brain has to develop. And you hear these bizarre things like when a newborn, I mean, you mentioned 10%. When a newborn baby is asleep, it could be as much as 80% of the energy. that the newborn baby is using is being used by its brain. I mean, partly just to run the brain, but also to grow the brain as well. So yeah, there's this bizarre energy prioritization, and then you use that to acquire all these resources. You acquire all this energy, you pump it into your offspring, you pump it into yourself just to keep your brain going. And then we've kind of had this sort of runaway train of the brain getting bigger and needing more energy, and and but being the thing that allows us to acquire that energy. And the two things have just gone on a sort of positive feedback loop, I suppose the scientists would call it. And it's just compounded and compounded and snowballed. But again, it's like, well, we did that, and that's all very well, but why has this not happened in anything else? There are other, there's chimps. Chimps got pretty intelligent. They kept their brain a kind of reasonable size, and chimps did pretty well. Why didn't we just stick with that?
Is there any way to find the reason for that though? Is there
Yeah, I mean,
any
as I
like
say,
in the
it's
future?
it's it's difficult when we're the only species that's done it, or we're the only lineage that's done it. Obviously, there've been multiple human species, and we're just happen to be the only one left, or maybe we're a kind of genetic fusion of two or three of them. I suppose the problem is that when I mean, anything in science where you have a sample size of one, the answer is it's very hard to work out. Well, I mean, we had a similar thing with I mean, I'm a reproductive biologist really at heart, and we had this a similar thing with menopause, which is where it was thought humans were unique in that halfway through their lives, human females just stopped being fertile, stopped being able to conceive offspring. And but there were all these theories about why it was. People argued about it. And then they discovered that killer whales do it as well, which immediately allows you to test some of your ideas. You created all these ideas for humans, and you can just look at killer whales and say, well, do they work with killer whales? And actually, quite a lot of them do. And I think we'll discover a few more whales that do menopause as well. We can apply the same ideas to them. And this is this ability to compare that allows you to really work out why particular species did what they did. The problem with the sort of this outlandish growth of the human brain is we haven't got another species that's done it. And so, with no points of comparison, it's very hard um, to know where to start. So, I'm not sure we'll ever really find out. I mean, one thing I've often wondered is what was it that was unusual about humans at the beginning of this process that maybe meant that suddenly it was worth it for us? What else is unusual about humans that probably came before this out of control expansion of the human brain? And the thing we did do, which was very unusual and pretty much unique, is walking around on two legs, bipedal locomotion. We do walk in a way that no other animal walks, freeing up our hands, putting our body into a completely different position. I know chimps and gorillas can sort of lumber around on two legs, but they can't stand upright and walk for long periods of time like we can. And the human method of locomotion, first of all, it is unique. There's nothing else that moves like us. And we're pretty sure that that predated this dramatic increase in brain size. So if I had to come up with a reason for why we did it and nothing else has done it, I think I'd have to link it to our weird way of moving around. It's hard to say exactly what that was, but I think I think that's the best explanation because it's unique and we know it came first.
Yeah, especially without good points of comparison, it'll be really hard to do research, as you're saying. So then, essentially, the only way you can really even start answering this question is finding more points of comparison if they even exist. Like you talked about whales, so then that's probably the only way, right? So since
Yeah,
we're talking about different species, there's of course patterns in evolutions across species. So if you really picture evolution as a tree with it starting with different species starting with a common ancestor, then branching out over time, what would you say are the biggest turning points in how the vertebrate brain has branched out in the big evolutionary tree?
I think in a way that I mean the most interesting division I think comes mammals and reptiles that basically diverge. I mean, vertebrates came up onto land, and amphibians, we think, probably retain an arrangement of the brain pretty similar to the sort of the ancestral state. So sort of not that dissimilar to what you see in, sharks and quite a lot of, aquatic vertebrates. And then almost as soon as vertebrates were on land, two lineages split off that were basically able to breed on land without having to go back to the water like an amphibian does. And one of them was the lineage leading towards mammals. They didn't look like mammals yet. Um, and the other was the lineage leading towards reptiles and birds and dinosaurs and all those things. And that sort of bifurcation into those two big groups. I mean, there were many things that differed between those two big groups, but one of them was that they both reconfigured and emphasized, they've reconfigured their brains and they've emphasized completely different parts of their brain, especially the cerebrum, the forebrain big bit up at the front. And they've gone off in completely different directions in the way that they organize them. Um, and in a way, I think that was a very dramatic splitting point. And we don't know why they split, why they did that. The reptile lineage, reptile slash bird lineage, just emphasized a particular part of the forebrain, and now that makes up the majority of their forebrain. Mammals, in a way, were more interesting. Mammals have done all sorts of weird things. They've adapted. There's a long, long evolutionary history before we even started looking like mammals. But with the brain, yeah, we emphasize a different bit from the reptiles, but also we changed the way that our forebrains were arranged. You hear a lot about the cortex, don't you, when you hear about neuroscience? And the cortex is the sheet of grey matter. Grey matter is the nerve cells, the cell bodies that spread out over the surface of the forebrain. And this is a mammalian thing where you have a sheet of grey matter of cells arranged over the outside of the brain, and then underneath it is all what's called the white matter, which is all the connections between those cells. And so we have this external sheet of cells and that's connections running underneath them. Reptiles and birds, they're not like that. The grey and the white matter is spread throughout the depth of the forebrain in the way that they were ancestrally. Um, and so it's only mammals that have done this rearrangement. So when people talk about the cortex, only mammals have it. What the advantages might be for having this two-dimensional sheet of brain tissue rather than the sort of solid mass of it, I don't know, but it's a very distinctive feature. So I think that in a way that's the most fundamental divergence you see within the vertebrates.
So you're talking about how mammals have a very weird evolutionary pathway. What do you think is probably the most unique or interesting part of their evolutionary pathway?
Mammals, I mean, there are various things that mammals particularly specialize in. Uh, but again, a bit like the human story, really. Lots of it's to do with acquiring energy. The thing mammals can do is they have amazingly complex jaws, jaw muscles, and teeth as well. They have these two generations of neatly intermeshing teeth. And basically, what this comes down to is that mammals can chew. Other vertebrates can't really chew. So, I mean, you see this, if you give a tortoise a piece of lettuce, what comes out the back end of the tortoise looks like a slightly splashed up piece of lettuce. Whereas you give a piece of lettuce to a rabbit, the thing that comes out the back end looks like this burnt little cinder that's had every possible bit of nutrition extracted from it. And that's what mammals can do. And one of the main reasons they can do this is because they can chew and grow that food into very small particles so they can digest it very quickly, very efficiently, chuck it out the back end, eat some more. So as long as they've got a high food supply, they can produce bizarre amounts of energy compared to most other vertebrates. And one of the things that you need lots of energy for is the brain. I mean, obviously mammals use it for other cool things like making milk for their offspring and being very active and being able to inhabit very cold environments and things like that. But the brain is one of the things that all this energy gets used for. So I think it's just a phenomenal ability to acquire energy, which hasn't really. It's birds have kind of ended up being able to do it in a completely different way, but the other reptiles haven't. But birds rather magically managed to do it without knowing how to chew, which in some ways is even cleverer. So it's a weird one. I'd say chewing.
Okay. Yeah, it's very intriguing. So, a lot of our listeners are students who might want to go into medicine or research, or just people who are interested with the brain, like I am. So, I just want to get practical for a second. What's a mindset that you think every future biologist should adopt early?
I think the most important thing is just being interested in stuff, interested in how the world works. Um, if you're, if you just look at some, you watch a YouTube video about some weird bit of chemistry or biology or physics or maths, and you just think, oh, that's cool, then that's the sort of mindset you need. I mean, often it'll be in biology, but I wouldn't worry if it's not. It's all science, and to be honest, the further you get into biology, it gradually turns into chemistry and physics and maths anyway. So just if you're interested and you like, I mean, this is now's a good time to be doing it because lots of this stuff is up there on YouTube, and there's these weird, people who blow things up or fire bullets at things, or there's things about what different bits of the brain might be doing, or the history of how we understood the brain, all that stuff. If you just find that stuff interesting, then that's the main thing you need because studying things is a lot easier if you're interested in them, and you'll probably end up being a lot better at the things you're interested in.
Yeah. Especially YouTube is a wonderfully versatile and just vast resource, especially now with so many people talking about science in general. So yeah, I agree. So if
Yeah.
somebody really wanted to get into anatomy specifically or like the brain without having the access to a lab, how do you think they should begin with that?
I think probably the easiest thing to do, and it wasn't really available when I was young, is if you get, I mean, if you just, I don't know, I guess you just do an internet search for MRI scans online or something like that. Because, as I say, it had been invented when I was still a student, but it hadn't been adapted, so it's actually usable yet. As magnetic resonance imaging is this sort of almost magical technique that exists where effectively you take something, often a brain, but it doesn't have to be a brain, and you stick it inside this enormous magnet, um, and then you fire a radio pulse at it, and then basically the protons that are aligned, their spin is aligned in the magnet, the antennal pulse knocks them out of alignment, and then as they fall back, they give off a radio signal. And then this is the magic bit. Somehow the machine can detect that radio signal and construct the internal structure of the object that's giving that radio source back out again. That's how an MRI machine works. So it means if you do that sort of Google search, there are free resources where you can basically just scan your way through a brain. You just use a little scroller wheel on your mouse or whatever it's called, and you can start at the bottom of the brain and you can take it in sections up to the top of the brain. You can go in any direction you like, and there are free resources that allow you to do this. To be honest, the free ones are high definition for almost anybody, really. You don't need to. I mean, we the ones we use to train our students, they've only got a little bit more information in them than those. So lots of this stuff is just freely available. So I'd have a look at that. The problem with actually trying to look at brains themselves is, first of all, you've got to find a brain, which may be difficult. The other thing is brains are very, very slushy. They're sometimes said to have a consistency sort of set custard. And so, unless you have a way to actually put a fixative into the brain to make it harder and more resilient, dissecting it as sort of a fresh, I suppose, brain is pretty unrewarding. And so I think MRI is the way to start now, definitely.
Hmm. Yeah. Before we conclude for the day, I just wanted to end with a question that's more philosophical. When you study comparative anatomy and look at a lot of what is shared with other animals, what does that tell us about what it means to be a human?
Well, this is something that's always fascinated me because, I mean, when I trained, I worked as a vet, and then I did a zoology degree, and then my first research job was working on animals, basically. And then I decided, no, I'm going to work on human stuff next. And that was what I was doing at Oxford. And I'd be sitting around talking to the other people who worked there, who were all doctors, all medics, almost all of them. And they'd say, so do animals do this? Do animals do blah, 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 blah? And I realized humans are really, really strange in all sorts of ways. And one of the great things about being a zoologist is you often don't deal much with humans, not till quite a lot later, and then you realize how weird they are. So uh, yeah, I think it's don't worry about humans too much to start off with. Learn about other things. Then when you get onto humans, you realize how utterly weird they are, or you realize what about them is weird. There's some things we do that all the other animals do, and that's quite boring. But there are some things we just think, no, that is strange.
Yeah. Dr. Bainbridge, thank you so much for guiding us through millions of years of evolution in such a brief discussion, really. I think our conversation really reminds us that being human isn't about being the smartest species. It's about trying to understand that different species are very unique and humans are especially weird in many of its facets. If you guys enjoyed this episode, share it with somebody else who might enjoy it too. And if it left you with questions, good. That's the point. If you guys enjoyed this episode and learned something new, make sure to follow on your favorite podcasting platform or on YouTube. I'm Avnish, this is The Early Perspective, and I'll see you in the next episode.